Swetam, welcome to our podcast.
Well, thank you, Joanne.
Thank you. I know you're in Mauritius for a very, very brief period of time, so thank you for making the time to sit down with us today.
Well, my pleasure, and thanks for having me.
So you're a writer now.
I can say I'm a published author. Yeah.
I mean, we'll talk about the book mainly in this episode, but I wanted to know what was your inspiration for writing a book?
Well, in particular, this one, it's my father, but also the person I'm actually writing about, my great-grandfather. So I've only learned about the family history much later in my life. Yes, there were, conversation within the family about, where we came from and so forth, but we didn't really, delve deep enough into the history. And then when I was much, much younger, my father did some of the digging up of the past history and so forth. And we realized that there was a lot of rich material that we can use to understand and piece things together and understand where we came from. So starting with birth certificates of, the ancestors and so on. And then gradually we found in the loft and other, sort of hidden boxes and so forth at my grandfather's house that there were documents, books that belonged to the family, sort of archive. One book in particular was one written by my great-grandfather, Duki Gungah. So how come this son of an Indian immigrant who never went to school, spent his youth and later life in the sugarcane field and so on,
to write a book?
Write a book, publish a book. And not just any book, it was a book that would commemorate the 100th anniversary of the centenary of the Indian arrival in Mauritius. So there was a purpose behind that as well. So, from all these little pieces of information to kind of understand the person who did that and then what else he achieved in life. So that was kind of the reason behind it, really. My father kind of began that research. Certainly other historians looked into it, not just those in Mauritius, but externally from abroad. But nothing yet had given me a sense of who he was as a person or the context within which he lived. So everyone was talking about his life, his achievements, of which there were many. But what was important for me and what was missing was to understand the context. And that's where I spent years, 10 years nearly, to go through all sorts of archives, not just in Mauritius, but also, fortunately enough, the British kept a lot of record when they were in Mauritius.
So you did a lot of your research here, like from the archives here?
Here, but mostly in London.
And they were accessible?
Yes, and it's open to the public, so at the British Library and a lot of other places. So we're fortunate that we have access to that. And going perhaps more relevant to your area of expertise, there are the legal documents. So every court case that was ever trialed in Mauritius from, the 1850s. Yeah, you're going back from when the British took over, literally, yeah. So it's all recorded, logged, so you can look up certain names. And that's where I found out that, there were court cases on trivial things that happened in Mauritius, So I basically went everywhere that I could get my hands on to understand how Mauritius was in those years, particularly around 1850s, because that's when the first of the family came in Mauritius.
Okay. So your great-grandfather, the one you write about, he was born here?
He was born. He is the first Mauritian, if you will, in 1867. But his father came in 1854 when he was about 25. So as a young man to come and work in the fields. That was the dream that was sold. So
but the reality
was very different.
Yeah.
But even then, getting to Mauritius itself was another hurdle they had to go through, because a lot of them hadn't even seen the sea. They've never even been near the shores of India. So they left from Bihar, which is hundreds of miles away from the coast of Calcutta, all in search of a better life. Because we have to realize, why do we move? Why do we migrate? Why do we go and look for things, elsewhere? And these are stories common to us as well. Even now, we leave Mauritius to go and study or work abroad. Some of us do come back. And the same happened to the Indian immigrants. They went to look for a better life. Some chose to come back to India after their 5-year contract ended at their own expense. And others, like my family, they decided to stay behind in Mauritius and make a life. So again, these stories about migration and how you adapt to a new culture and mix with other peoples of different background, different languages, and so on. We talk a lot about that in current Britain, which is where I live now and work. People from different parts of the world still converge to London and England. And that lots of talks around migrants and their contribution to society. The same story can be told 100 years ago. How did the previous batch who came to Mauritius, particularly the French who took them from mostly Africa, but also southern part of India, how did they react to those who came later? Did they see them as, immigrants? So there was all of these things happening. And if you put yourself in the mindset of a person who's only just arrived, doesn't speak the language, doesn't understand the new environment he's part, and they have to work and make a living. How do they adapt? So that culture shock, which we also have experienced as, being Mauritians in London or England, getting used to new kind of weather, food, and so on. So it's the same difference, same elements, and it's no different from what they went through. Obviously, of a different magnitude, because
Sure.
but the fundamentals are the same.
Similar.
Yeah.
You said that you kind of gradually did your research over 10 years or so. Did you have in mind that you wanted to write a book eventually? Was there already germinating in your...
I love writing, and I've written other pieces of work, not just prose, but also poetry, but never really published a book as such. I've published in newspapers and magazines and so forth. My intention when I heard of his story, and I gradually began to, look for more pieces of information, was to ultimately publish a book. And even though others have, again, they've written about him in magazines and so forth, it wasn't the full story. It was just a sketch of a person's life. But as I said, I wanted to bring some context, some historical context around that. And I wrote in the book, and I'm going to quote that. If you think of a candle and a very bright torch, the torch might seem more, imposing and impressive compared to a small flickering candle. But the context matters. So what I'm saying there is, imagine being in a dark, gloomy night, and you have a candle. That's worth more than holding a bright torch in broad daylight.
Absolutely.
So that person, which is the candle there, in those gloomy times of Mauritius in the early 20th century, his contribution compared to someone who's now, living in much better condition and still achieving things.
It's more impactful.
It's more impactful and it's more meaningful as well. So that's what I wanted to bring. Not comparing like for like. Oh, you've written a book. Yeah, everyone writes a book now. But to be an author in 1930s in Mauritius, in those contexts, particularly coming from a background where you've never been, formally educated.
So he was self-taught presumably then?
Absolutely. So his, love or passion for reading and writing must have been in him. And he's always found himself drawn to not just the, sort of religious elements of his culture, but also the spiritual aspect. in the sense that he would look beyond those, let's say, artificial differences, in terms of whether you are an Orthodox or liberal Hindu. Because he helped, eventually, he turned out to be a pioneer in different areas, changing norms in the times when some of a particular caste would look down upon others. And him being one of those castes which weren't seen favorably, let's put it that way, by his own character of the person he was, others around him saw him as, let's say, being very pious, very spiritual and religious in that sense, right? So other pundits and sort of scholars of Hinduism around him recognized that fact in him.
Did they see that as a threat, or they welcomed it?
Well, it kind of worked both ways, in the sense that as a threat, yes, from those from, let's say, a higher caste, but those pundits themselves are obviously, of the sort of Brahmin caste, right? So they said, how come someone who's a non-Brahmin is so spiritual and, helping everyone from across all backgrounds, not just the Hindi-speaking or Bhojpuri-speaking, but Tamil and Telugu and other languages. He was literally helping with anything and everything, really, financially and otherwise. And I talk about that as well. Culturally in Mauritius in those years, what did it mean to have a temple, some place you can go to and do your prayers? It's more than just a religious aspect. There's a social aspect to that as well, which is very important, because you take away this, you practically taking away the identity of the person. And I talk about that because there's a difference between the system of indentureship and slavery. Mm-hmm. Slavery was harsh because they literally stripped away everything about the person. So the person was no longer a person, it was an object.
Yeah, as they said in the Code Noir, you were just a chose un bien meuble.
Absolutely. So you're a commodity, traded and so forth. So if you take away everything about the person, not just the clothes off their back or the food or the material things, but the more subtle things about the languages, the culture, the religion, which they did to those slaves from Africa, then the person loses, the meaning, the purpose, the bearing in life. So they start questioning about who they are. And when they've lost that, what they do is they latch on to someone else's identity. In the case of Mauritius, it was about, Christianity. So they would basically take on the religion of their owners. But their own culture and languages and religion, they lost that.
Completely lost,
absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
So that one thing was different about the indentureship system.
I see.
Yes, we talk about the fact that they were paid, small wage and so forth. The conditions were bad, if not, as bad as when it was for the slaves. But the one crucial difference was at least they came with their sense of identity.
Which they kept.
Which they kept, for most part. Some did convert, but for the most part, they kept that identity, which was defined by, in their case, their religion and their scriptures and so forth. So that was important. If you take yourself back in, the 1890s in Mauritius, there were hardly any places of worship for those who came from India. Yeah, they had their own rituals they did between, among themselves, but there was no temples as such. So for someone to build a temple was considered as an act of piety, and he did that. My great-grandfather financed
with his own money that he saved over the years.
Yes, absolutely. So he came from a background where, his father was working in the fields, and so did he. There were some opportune moments in time when the price of sugar on the global market crashed. So we go through these economic cycles, still the case today. So prices went down, and the other plantation owners obviously made a loss, so they had to sell off these estates. In some cases, as they do these days, we call it morcellement. They parcel it and sell it in small portions. So he managed to buy a small portion.
I see. Okay.
And that was kind of the start of the, enterprise, if you will, of the family. And that's where his vision about, how do I make the most of what I have, regardless of the amount. So he's purchased his first plot of land when he was about 21, and started from there and acquired other plots, other neighboring plots, all within the area where he was born. So it's around, New Grove, Rosebel, Debras, that sort of area. He was born in Debras, which is, in that neighborhood. And then from there, kind of acquired other plots of land. Ultimately, to just kind of extend that in the future, when he was in his 50s, from a tiny plot of land, he managed 7 sugar estates. Not just one.
Wow.
Yes, 7.
That's quite impressive.
That's a lot. Obviously, there's his family with him to help with the management of all these estates and selling his sugar to other factory mills, if you will, in Rosebel and so on. So again, when you kind of try and understand where he came from and where he ended up, as this wealthy, I'm not going to shy away either from telling you, bluntly that he was perhaps one of the early millionaires in Mauritius. He was seen as a super rich person, but others,
but completely self-made.
Completely self-made.
He came from a boat with probably just a few pieces of clothes.
He had absolutely nothing. He grew, in a very sort of destitute type of place, in a small hut. His name itself is significant because imagine your parents naming you Duki, which in Hindi means unfortunate or
really
grief or sadness or all this sort of sentiment that you would have around being sort of in a destitute kind of place. So to name your son, your firstborn, as this, to me implies that they were actually in a mindset which was very, dark in the sense that things weren't looking very bright, very positive. And I questioned myself why. So when I did my research, so the year he was born, Mauritius was kind of at the tail end of a malaria epidemic. And if I remember correctly, about 12% of the population was decimated, which in those days, still now is 12% is significant.
A lot. Yeah, that's way more than COVID, for example.
Yes, so that's what happened in the years preceding his birth. And among all of that, there were droughts and floods and cholera. And so a lot of things happened which, for those who had left India to come to Mauritius, thinking the life they're going to live was going to be better, because there was still famine and diseases in India, So they ended up in a place which was perhaps worse. So they couldn't go back either. They were stuck here 5 years having to live in those conditions. And when you have that around you as you're sort of feeding into your being, you're obviously going to have very,
dark thoughts
pessimistic outlook about life. And therefore they named him Duki. But anyway, so he obviously overcame all of those obstacles and so forth. Family also being very important, because that's another thing I mentioned is...
Did he have many
He
children?
had, ultimately, the family had, so there were 8 brothers.
Right.
So...
No girls.
No girls, all boys, no girls. But that's also significant because even though it was mostly a male household, 7 or 8 boys and a father, I understand that he must have had a lot of respect and admiration for his mother. Okay. And ultimately for his wife and all the womenfolk in the household, because, which was quite unique at that time is he ensured that not just the men, but also the women and the girls had access to work and education, not just in his own household, but in the community around him. And he ultimately ran a dozen schools. So that's another thread in his life, not just the religious aspect, but also education.
So he was quite ahead of his time in many respects, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of emancipation of women, but also looking at education more broadly. So even though he himself didn't go to school formally, and there were a number of schools, but most in those from Indian origin didn't go to the schools. Not just because you had to pay for them, and for some which were free, there was some apprehension that you had to be converted to that particular
religion or whatever, yeah.
If you were to send your children there, they will be converted, So there was that fear, and they didn't send their children to school. It was quite significant because of all the children age, school age from 5 to 15 or whatever, only 2% of those went to school. 98% of children worked in the fields or other minorities.
And we're talking about early 20th century here.
Yes, so we're looking at 1870s, 1880s.
Wow.
His childhood. And even before then, there was even less opportunity to go to school to study. So only 2% actually had a formal education. So he was part of those 98% who didn't go to school. So he must have realized the importance of having a formal education as well, because when he had enough means, let's say financially, so then we're talking about the early 1900s, he built those, what we call bedcars, so little areas of congregation where children would go and learn about their culture and mostly about their religion. But he ensured that beyond this, they would be taught the other subjects which were taught in schools. Other bedcars weren't necessarily focusing on that, but he ensured that they had access to mathematics, geography, history, and other subjects. Primarily taught in Hindi.
Okay.
So that was the language which most of them would be familiar with, as opposed to French or English. So that it's more accessible. And then he, with the help of other scholars, and one Pandit in particular, Pandit Vishwanath, in 1920s, he published the first syllabus in Hindi for his schools, and that became almost like a reference for other schools.
I see.
And then he basically was running all of these schools as though he was the institution in himself. But
well, he had to create something from nothing,
absolutely.
Really. Yeah.
So what I mean by that, so everything you need to run a school, from your test books to providing access to a teacher and paying their salaries, giving those children access to, everything they needed for school, even their clothes, because some of them, weren't clothes with. Anyway, so every element of that he financed out of his own pocket. Wow. Paying the teachers' salaries, having an inspector come in and
ensure the quality was
absolutely.
there, etc.
And we're talking 100 years ago.
Wow.
And him doing that, and not necessarily every school had other schools had the same sort of setup, but he ensured that his schools, at least, were of a certain standard, had their own syllabus, structure, even certificates were issued. And we have copies of that at home in the family archive. So children would obviously be rewarded if they did well. Girls would get jewelry, for instance. There's little things like that which would encourage other girls to come to school. Teachers were provided incentives as well. The more children you bring to school, the higher your salary will be. So that was an incentive for them to kind of
gather more children
absolutely.
From the village. And that was it still quite regional at the time?
Very regional.
Okay.
But he ran schools nationally, so in Paul Louis and other places in Mauritius as well.
Was there anything in your research that you did? Because before we started recording, I was telling you that I started just flicking through this book I have at home, which unfortunately I haven't had the chance to read fully yet, written by Sidney Selvon. So I focused on the chapters about the Indian immigration. Was there anything in your research that shocked you, that you didn't know before, that you found out?
Yeah, so a lot of things around the way they were treated, the Indian immigrants, and how they faced all these hurdles to try and be themselves in a place which wasn't necessarily the most welcoming. What I mean by that, we had the vagrant law, if you see what I mean, in 1867. So the year Duki Gungah was born in 1867, the vagrant law was imposed in that, they basically didn't have the freedom of movement. You were bound to your estate. If you were to leave that, obviously they weren't chained as the slaves were, but
Wow.
in the same way that, if you were to leave your estate and try and go and work elsewhere, God forbid, then...
So you could be jailed for that? That was a criminal offense?
And there were jails. And where is that now? In Yakasi, I think, or Bai. There's the vagrant depot there. It's still around, obviously, old stone building. So there was things like that which, they were, mistreated in a number of ways, but also things around, again, education being an important pillar in a person's life. So they didn't have access to education, like I said. And when I sort of looked into more around how many schools were run, how many were supported by the government and so forth, most of them were obviously from the church or other religious background. So again, there was not much that was accessible to those of an Indian origin. So it didn't seem like anything was there to help them integrate with society and be their own person and learn about their own culture. So for when he came around, he was the first to initiate all of that. Wow. Okay. Years later, obviously, well, many, many years later, then we're talking about the father of free education and so forth. But if you step back, he was the first in that area.
That's fascinating.
Yes, yeah.
Was there anything as you kind of tried to build a picture of his personality as you did your research as to what drove him? The reason I asked that is that I don't know whether you've read this book, very famous book, Men's Search for Meaning. So written by a Holocaust survivor, obviously terrible, terrible circumstances, and you basically treated, as you were saying, treated like a nothing. Basically, you're a number, and you keep going. You keep going in spite of, in the face of all the hardship. As you call the book The Altruist, what do you think drove him?
That's a very good question, and because I hadn't known him personally, it's very hard to then paint a picture of someone you've not met physically and, like we're doing now, sit down and have a conversation. But what you can imply is that through his actions, his deeds, that person couldn't have been anything but selfless in everything he did, or pious in his action, or benevolent. All these qualities doesn't just come around because you decide to be kind and, I'm going to be. No, these are innate qualities. You're born with that. So certainly he's been inspired by people around him, because we all are. I'm inspired by my father and my family and so on. So you have that. But as a person, you are self-driven by your own
moral compass.
Compass, but you have certain, let's say, motives in life, things you want to do for your own self-fulfillment. And these might change through life, obviously, depending on circumstances. But every person is driven by things which give them meaning. And I didn't, on purpose, expand on that in the book, but I do mention that in my own research, I came to question my own identity. Whether it's defined by my native origin, as in from where I was born, or is it defined by my ancestral origin, which are two different things.
Of course.
In my case.
What's the answer?
So my answer is I ultimately realized identity is fluid. At least from my experience. For others, it might not be. In the sense that it's a never-changing state. I might identify as a Mauritian in a certain context. In other contexts, I might identify as, someone of an Indian origin with this particular ancestral story.
Or British.
Or Brit, I was going to come to that. I might identify as a British because I now live and work in England. So all these elements of identity is what make you as a person, and it doesn't have to be static. If you were to ask me the question 20 years ago, I'd have a very different answer. 20 years from now, I'm going to give you a different answer. And it's okay to have an identity that changes. I used to think that your identity is what you were born with, and you stay with that throughout life.
Yeah.
Or what other people assign to you. But it is very much what you think is you, ultimately. So anyway, but I didn't go into that much of a sort of philosophical...
Yes, it was more, I guess, more factual.
More factual, and, I want to kind of to keep it within scope of that particular book. But these are questions that I came up with in my own research, and perhaps going to expand on that in a different book. But these are very important things to ask oneself. Who you are and what gives you meaning. And fortunately or unfortunately, no one else can provide you that answer. Not even your parents or your children or your spouse or anyone else. I'm saying that because these are persons who would perhaps know you best. But even those persons who know you best don't know you as a person.
Yeah, and it requires deep inner work as well. We had someone on the podcast 2 weeks ago, and I asked them, what is their why? And they said actually they've discovered growth. And I think we all have a similar why in some shape or form, because we, as we go through life, there are different stages. What drove you when you were in your 20s might be different to what drives you now. You probably discovered through this book, as you said, your family, your ancestral history, but also perhaps gave you insight into how you would like to be in the future. I don't know how you would like your son to, your children to.
I don't know, and difficult question to answer, because not that we don't, no one knows what's the future going to be like or what it holds for us, but I think, and I write about that in the book as well, what defines your future is your legacy. So if you're going to think about what you're going to leave behind, not just in terms of material stuff, your estate or your whatever, but the message you want to leave behind, the memory you want to leave behind, your legacy, ultimately, this is what will define your future. So if you think about that, then that almost gives you something to aspire to try and achieve. So your legacy, and for me, in my case, it's true, your legacy is defined by your history. So you have to understand where you came from to kind of get an idea of where you're heading to as well. And that's why history is also important.
What is the core... Presumably you haven't written this book just for yourself, although you probably learned a lot from it. So what is the core message that you wish the reader to take from this book?
Well, if there's one thing, I think it would be to emulate the person that Gungah was. And I think, I've got it written down, it's, be kind. Because out of kindness comes holiness. And if you take away that as a message and simply be kind, I think a lot of kindness would come to you as well.
Yeah. That's a wonderful message. I was just reading in the Prophet Khalil Gibran said that hands of the giver are never empty.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's exactly what he did, because as you said, he was probably one of the first millionaires, and that didn't stop him from giving more, and he probably received more by giving more.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a quote about him that obviously he was a very wealthy person and everyone knew he was wealthy, but to them, what was more valuable to them was not his wealth, but his generosity. The fact that he was a benevolent person. Generous doesn't even touch what he was, because it wasn't just a question of giving left, right, and trying to help people, but to change how things are done as well. And I think I kind of mentioned that earlier, but for instance, one example is prayers by the priests, Brahmin priests, weren't held in households of the non-Brahmin.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so things like, if you imagine, your wedding, birth, funeral, so these important episodes in one life, particularly is around a prayer, that's the kind of tradition. But they didn't have access to that. And so because he was working with a lot of these pandits on other projects, like, this Hindi book that he wrote and so forth, they couldn't understand why a person of his background couldn't hold a prayer in his house. So they changed that. So the pandit came to his house, they held these prayers, and then gradually over the years, everyone recognized that, we should be able to do that. And so they changed the norms in those years, and we're talking 100 years ago and more, so that now others of other background, other caste,
Wow.
were then entitled to
So they had no access to prayers. They had to do their own
They had
rituals
to do
among
their own,
themselves.
and,
No priests, basically.
No priests, yeah, because they wouldn't step into someone's house, someone who isn't of that particular caste. And so he changed that. Now, everyone does it, obviously,
yeah.
but we don't realize that
Yeah.
if it wasn't for him.
We assume it was always the case.
If you asked me earlier what other things shocked me, was one of those things that,
Gosh.
things we take for granted now, but weren't necessarily the case. And then to be the person who changes all of that, the perspective and perception around those people, I think it's significant. He also was responsible, I say responsible, not that he wrote the book, but he made it possible. So you might have written a book, but it's sitting in the drawer, no one's reading it. But he made it that the author was able to publish the book. And I'm talking about 1923, so literally 100 years ago. And the reason I wanted to publish my book this year was to commemorate that centenary, that the first Hindi book to be published in Mauritius was a book called, in English, History of Mauritius, Mauritius Ka Itihas in Hindi. So that was a very important book because it was the first book in Hindi that was accessible to the majority of the population. Otherwise, you had French and English books. So that opened up, let's say, the minds of people of Indian origin, Indo-Mauritians, to a bit of their own history and what the country was like and so forth. Otherwise, they had no idea.
Yes, well, obviously the other languages were foreign languages to
Absolutely,
them, English
yeah.
and French.
And you didn't have access to
education to learn those languages.
Learn it, absolutely. So having that book in 1923 was, again, a turning point.
Yeah.
Because that then gave others who came later, let's say scholars of Mauritian origin, to publish their book. But if that book didn't happen, others probably wouldn't have happened then. So he made that possible. So Dikigang, and that book was so important. And I write about that as well. It might look like a small book, but
there's a lot of information packed in there.
I've condensed all of that in it, and
Yeah.
That's why it's
I guess, as you said before we started recording, you wanted to make it accessible to
Right.
people of all ages, and so that they felt that from a child of 10 years old to up to 99 that they
whatever,
could read it.
exactly. And it's filled with a lot of these little pieces of information that, I'm going to leave it to the reader to go and find out more. So I'm not going to give you everything, because that's going to turn it into a big, massive book, which might put off a few people, but at least there's enough in there for you to go and find out more. Yeah. But those important pieces of information, like, the publication of the book in 1923, that caused, I would say,
bit of a scandal, perhaps. Or
yes, and the author was beaten and kicked around in Pauli, near the market in Pauli, by others who thought the book was insulting to those of Indian origin, particularly because the book was dedicated to my great-grandfather. Why would you dedicate the book to someone who is not of a particular caste?
Wow.
Yes, so the author was then threatened, and he was an Indian author basically, who was in Mauritius. He came because Manilal Doctor, who is fairly famous in Mauritius, who was sent by Gandhi to look into the plight of the indentured immigrants and so on. So Manilal Doctor was running the first Hindi newspaper called the Hindustani. When he left, before he left, he asked another journalist editor to come and take over and run the newspaper. That was Pandit Atmaram Vishwanath. So when he came in 1912, he spent a good 10 years to go around Mauritius as a journalist would, a reporter, and investigate and learn about the culture and the people and so on. So he went all around the island, and obviously there were other estate owners of Indian origin, but the one person who stood out was my great-grandfather.
Wow.
And that's coming from someone who has no vested interest to talk about the family. It's coming in as an
external observer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he interviewed a lot of people, and he, wanted to understand their life and so on. So in his research, writing his book, he realized that Dukhi Gungah was unique as a person through his deeds, what he did in terms of education and religion and so on. So he dedicated the book, the first book, again, to him. And when the book was published, and other Indian Mauritian found out,
too happy about that.
Nope. He was threatened. He was like, we're going to deport you back to India, and they're going to seize the book. And they did seize the book. They burned his book and so forth. And then later on, so a year later, when they did actually spend time reading his book, they realized, okay, it wasn't as bad as they thought. And they asked him to republish the book. And he maintained that even then he would dedicate the book to because he couldn't think of anyone else
who had so much impact, I guess.
So much impact in the history of Mauritius
and
as
hadn't
well.
previously been recognized formally, I
Absolutely.
guess. Yeah.
So that he maintained, and he writes about it as well in his acknowledgement, like why he think the book should be dedicated to him. So that is also in there, that little letter that
There's so much information back
That's what I said. There's a lot. So that was the hard work wasn't the writing in the book.
Yeah, it's the condensing.
It's how you condense all of that into something which is accessible to others. So you might think, oh, there's nothing to read in there, but there's a lot to take away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do we, I know it's not formally published yet, so how do we get hold of your book? When is it going to be out?
Yeah, so I don't have a date in mind. It will happen at least in England in the coming months, but then broadly, internationally, I think early next year.
Next year, yeah. I hope it's going to be on sale in the bookshops here. And,
I'm hoping to.
Yeah.
The other thing is, while I'm here, is I'm going to hand over a few copies to the Dukhi Gungah Government School. So there's actually a school named after him.
Oh.
So he donated a plot of land for the school. And like that, he did so many things, He gave away so much. So I will hand over a few books to...
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I look forward to reading it, and I hope everyone else will as well. I think, as you said, there are... And I've discovered that in other areas as well, you know, concerning slavery, for example, that there are many things we aren't taught at school.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to, as you said, to look into where we come from. And I think that would, you know, that paves the way to legacy, as you
Absolutely.
mentioned.
Yeah. I think that's a key message, that if you're finding purpose, finding meaning, often we are in that sort of common, you know, the present mindset, the sort of things around us. We're looking at that to help us define who we are and what we want to do.
Yeah.
I think look ahead, think of what you're going to leave behind, think of your legacy, and let that be what defines your purpose.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Swetam.
Well.
Thank you.